Hello for online students taking this class in the fall of 2019, Chapter 13, the Presidency. So this will be for my full semester and my second 8 weeks class. I'm recording this in the last Sunday of the month of October. So we have one more full month to go for both classes, and we're seeing quite a bit of material that's now been covered. By the time that many of you will have watched this recording for my full semester, you would have already taken the second exam, or we've already taken that exam, and students certainly in my second 8 weeks would have already taken their first exam for sure, and probably even the second exam by the time you get to this recording. So we're seeing the end of this semester for almost all of you, I'm sure, as you're reviewing this recording. So this is again from our last part of the third exam for our midterm exams, and this is of course part of chapters 1 through 15 that we have for our comprehensive final. So chapter 13, the presidency. Now this is from your text in the early part. As all the chapters, you can see that there's a work by the authors of this text to kind of get us into the process of thinking about this particular subject, the presidency, the executive branch. And we're looking at the power of the executive branch and considering that power. And so here, of course, like so many things that we're covering, when you look at this quote, you can see that it brings up also the overlapping of other chapters and how all of this does mix in together. And so here you're looking at not only chapter 13, the presidency, because it's a particular administration that appoints all these different individuals to be in charge of different bureaucratic agencies, but that involves, of course, also chapter 14, looking at the bureaucracy. And then you can also see chapter 11, interest groups. So the American Chemistry Council. So here you can see where, depending on the mindset and the strategy of a administration, they determine the individuals that they want to pick to put into these particular leadership positions. And then those individuals, of course, would have a certain agenda and strategy. And so that's what you can see as you read through this quote about the power of the presidency. And that power in some ways is not so noticeable to us as citizens, but we can see the outcome here. So the power of appointment, and that power certainly has a great deal of influence on how laws will be carried out and how they'll be interpreted. Like so many things that we have, I mean, there's all kinds of rankings, aren't there? I mean, here we are recording this in the midst of the college football season, so there's always rankings of those college football teams. And so not too surprising, there would be rankings of the presidents. And these would be a ranking of the presidents. So you could go online and get several different rankings. I would be willing to bet that in almost all cases of these 10 presidents, if you looked over a ranking, probably at least 7 or 8 of them would consistently be in almost every ranking. And so Lincoln I've never seen a ranking where he was not at the top. So you generally look at presidents that before the country was a certain way before that individual became president, and then the country was different after that presidency, and in most cases the country was better. And so as a result of that, that's where you would look at these rankings and why these individuals would be in this case. Now, there's some updated rankings that would have recent presidents considerably higher than what we may have on this ranking here. But that's generally the situation, and they generally would be known to be individuals who did some major activities while they were president. So I would assume from your history classes, these would be presidents for the most part that have been brought out. Somewhat controversial, certainly number 7, you can see on this list, Andrew Jackson. Not a beloved president for everyone, for sure, and some considerable reasons why he's not necessarily always popular. But you have plenty of reasons to put most of these presidents in the top 10. And there's also a bottom 10. So you look at presidents who, just by that same standard that I mentioned, the country was a certain way before the individual was president, and then the country was a certain way after that individual was president, and for the most part, it was not as good. And so that would be a reason why. Now, in some ways, you can look at just the individual failings of some of these presidents. Clearly, James Buchanan is almost always consistently the number 1 ranked worst president. Kind of perhaps a little convoluted how to describe that, but he's number 1 in the bottom 10. How about that? And almost always he would be in that case because before he was president, we had one country and we were not at war with one another. And then after his presidency, we have the Civil War. So you can't entirely lay it at his feet, but he could have done much more to try to prevent that war from happening. Harding and Johnson, for the most part, really just personal failings and considerably incompetent for that particular job. Some of these presidents, you're really just looking at, again, that they were perhaps dangerous with what they could have done. Richard Nixon would be in that category, and his abuse of power, at least what was indicated as an abuse of power before he resigned from office. U.S. Grant, in many cases, is becoming a president that is being reviewed again, and in a much more positive way, that perhaps he is a better president, and certainly in the terms of civil rights, than what he's generally given credit for. But if you're interested in any one of these presidents, you can Google them and find out more information about them and find some explanations as to why they're in the bottom part of the rankings of presidents. This is the oath of the presidency, and this is, of course, part of the Constitution, so this is specifically put together and written this way, that this is the oath that a president will take. Now, I think what's really worthwhile for us to know here is that what the president is sworn to or affirmed to protect and preserve is the Constitution. So that tells us how valuable the Constitution is. That really is what identifies us as Americans, what keeps the country together. So more so than any type of ethnicity or race or religion or language or culture or even a geographic area, it's the Constitution. And so that becomes the key part of what a president is there to defend. But there is an interesting aspect here to consider, and I hope that this is not too jolting for some of you to look at this picture. It's from the Boston Marathon terrorist attack a few years back now. And the statement here by a former Supreme Court Justice that the Constitution is not a suicidal pact. So, but this becomes a very, you probably have heard the phrase before, a very slippery slope to have a president or any particular individual in authority say, at this point, I'm going to suspend my defense of the Constitution in order to defend physically an area or a people. And while we might find that to be, we might find reasons to support that, where does that end, right? That becomes always the major question. And that if you start to say, well, okay, in this particular case, we'll go ahead and overlook the Fourth Amendment, or we'll overlook the Sixth Amendment, because we need to stop some potential terrorist attack or some other kind of crime. but can that really lead to considerable abuse? And I think we can all see that it would. So where exactly does it come down to the point of saying, well, we'll not necessarily follow the Constitution in some areas? We can find that that would be a very difficult area to reach. But not to say that it doesn't happen, and we've certainly had some very important presidents that have reached that conclusion. Abraham Lincoln, #1 on that ranking. That was certainly the way he looked at it. He would raise the question, should he defend the Constitution and lose the country? So what was most important to him was ultimately to protect the country. And if that meant that he did things that other individuals like Supreme Court justices didn't necessarily find to be constitutional, he wasn't going to worry about that too much. And so there's the ongoing debate on just how strictly and to what interpretation do you follow the Constitution if you're president. But of course, why this is always a major concern is we just look at the awesome powers that a president has and how they can very much be subject to abuse. The very first one that we see on this list, Commander-in-Chief of the military. My goodness, how a president could go about abusing that power, getting us into a war, causing a greater need to have more funds put into a war, perhaps suspend some people's constitutional rights because of a war. And so there would be all kinds of possibilities in that situation for potential abuse. We started this lecture by looking at the Trump administration and the way of putting an individual in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. And so presidents certainly have that ability to do so. They're in charge of the bureaucracy. So they can put individuals in these positions of authority based on what the president finds to be most important. And that's, again, a very considerable power. Calling Congress into session, vetoing legislation, all kinds of appointments that a president can make, negotiate and make treaties with other countries, and then really pretty much an absolute power to grant pardons. A person who is suspected of committing a federal crime can be pardoned by the president, really no questions asked. And so there you can see the kind of power that a president can have in many different areas here. There are limits, of course, and that's, we look back on our Constitution, we can always be reminded of ways in which there were limits to an individual's power, any one branch of government. So again, the idea of efficiency and effectiveness, not quite as important a goal by the authors of this Constitution, the people who helped frame the Constitution. That was not as important as it was to ensure that there was a balance of power, that no individual or group would have too much power. So we can consider ways in which presidents' power might be limited, such as overriding a veto, even though, as we can see here, that doesn't happen that often. So you have some considerable number of vetoes, and this may have changed since I put this together, but on 519 you can read some descriptions of vetoes. We've had one president where his batting average with vetoes overridden was pretty poor compared to most presidents. And Andrew Johnson, he had 29 vetoes, and 15 of them were in fact overridden. So that's that's a little bit over half. So in that area, that's a pretty high amount percentage-wise of vetoes being overridden. So he did not work well with Congress. It's pretty obvious. There was a big partisan difference there, and a big ideological difference at the end of the Civil War, and one group's support for some major changes in the Old South, and Reconstruction being supportive of that, where Johnson was not. And so you had considerable reasons for having his vetoes overridden. But overall, as of the time that I've recorded this, and as far as I know, 2,562 vetoes, 109 overridden. So most of the time, they're not overridden. That is a limit to a president's power, but it doesn't happen that often. And in fact, you have some presidents that were incredibly successful at having their vetoes sustained. So Grover Cleveland, as we see here, whose nickname was Uncle Jumbo, had 414 vetoes and only 2 overridden in his first term. This is the only president, some of you that are trivia buffs and president buffs probably know this, but he's the only president in our history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. So Cleveland was elected, defeated, and then re-elected. And so in his first term, pretty successful with the veto pen. But there are the ways in which you have other organizations and branches of government that can limit a president's power. Congress can override the veto. They can investigate a president. As I'm recording this, we certainly are probably aware, if you follow the news, about the impeachment inquiries, and so impeachment investigations that are going on. So Congress has that oversight ability. Bureaucracy can interpret president's commands and the ways that the president may want regulations to be enforced or not enforced, but they can make their own interpretations, and they can decide just how active they're going to be in following a president. That has its own risk, of course, in terms of people getting fired or perhaps even investigated for potentially breaking the law, but they do have that ability. Supreme Court could find a president actions to be unconstitutional. The public certainly can just not support a president, and the press in their investigation. So those are just some examples of organizations that can limit a president's power. And we can see here that there's been some debates in different kinds of legislation that's been involved to try to bring back power of Congress, or perhaps in some ways Congress has really never had this power, but has wanted to ensure that they would have this power when it comes to the use of the military. They're, after all, the ones who are ultimately to declare war. They're the ones that actually fund a military effort. So how much influence should they have, and involvement should they have in military activities? And so when a president decides to use the military, is there a need then for the president to consult Congress? And the Wars Powers Act, and as I'm recording this, we had head of ISIS that was killed in Syria, and most members of Congress were not really informed of this. Who should be informed? To what degree should they be informed? Of course, is always one of those issues. Presidents can certainly make the claim that the more people they know, the more likely that there's going to be some ability to give away some part of the clandestine operations. And so there's a strong motivation not to tell too many people, or hardly anyone really. But once again, you can see how that could be abused. So it's one thing to perhaps go after a head of a terrorist organization, but what if you're not consulting Congress on what military weapons are being used and what contracts are being carried out in terms of purchasing weapons? So it's an ongoing debate on just how much involvement should Congress have. And it's not really any kind of firm declaration there. But this is one attempt to do that, the War Powers Act. And you can see that came out at the time of the Vietnam War was winding down, what had been the longest war in American history before the Afghan War. And so there was an attempt by Congress to say, let's try to rein in the presidency here and get more involvement back as far as they were concerned. Maybe it never had been there, but the attempt to bring back the power of Congress so that the president needs to consult within 48 hours, and there can be a termination of deployment within 60 days unless Congress continues to approve. Every president since 1973, every single one of them, has not supported the War Powers Act, and every one of them has said they are not obligated to follow it. So this is Commander-in-Chief, as far as everyone who becomes president pretty much determines it's absolute, and they don't have to consult Congress in these kind of activities. And we'll come back to this because clearly it raises that question. What does this mean about our country and our government overall and the amount of power given to an individual in the executive branch? So especially when you're looking at the world today and the technologies today that you can deploy the military without using a human military individual, right? And we can see some good things about that, but that does involve a greater level of involvement and a greater level of intensity by bringing in somebody's son or daughter to be used in a military operation. So presidents perhaps are more likely to think harder about the situation if they're actually using human beings than to instead deploy a drone and what that might be used for a military operation. So does the president need to consult Congress if the president's going to deploy drones in another country? And again, slippery slope, where does that go? If your conclusion is no, they don't really need to consult Congress, what about using drones in this country? And so there's where you can see the debates about the use of military power. But certainly in the Obama administration, one of the better examples, the president at the time, President Obama, made the claim he did not have to consult Congress in the Libyan hostilities using military personnel and primarily using drones in that activity. There's not a great deal of qualifications to be president. These are it. These are the qualifications. There's 3 qualifications. And so just perhaps pause on this one and look this over. It's in your Constitution, of course, and you can see there. The one that's somewhat of a tricky area is the natural-born citizen. What does that mean? We don't have a firm definition on that. Does that mean that the individual has to be physically born in the United States? We've had one time in our history, 2008, we had the 2 major candidates for president, John McCain, Barack Obama, both of them not born in the continental United States. Obama born in Hawaii and McCain born in the Panama Canal Zone. But both of those were in fact U.S. One was a state, of course, Hawaii, and the other one was U.S. territory. But does it mean that you have to be born on U.S. soil? Or do your parents, or at least one parent, have to be a citizen? And then you could be born somewhere else. We've actually had candidates making that claim, that they don't have to be born in the United States. So as long as their parents were U.S. citizens. So the obscure or perhaps bizarre way of looking at this is the courts have by and large said we can't make any type of determination of this unless there is a way of looking at harm, and then that you have to then bring this case to court to make a determination of what is in fact constitutional, and that could only occur when someone's qualifications are now in doubt once that individual has become president. So as far as the courts are concerned, this is always getting the cart before the horse, because none of this has ever been a question of someone who is in fact president. So until we have someone who becomes president, in which we can't fully explain if they are in fact qualified to be president, we can't question a person's qualifications. Well, that seems strange, but nevertheless, that's the way that this has been reviewed by the courts in the area of the Constitution. So what does it mean to be a natural-born citizen? It's not 100% sure by anyone's interpretation. We have had a fairly consistent background for almost all presidents, and this is a case in which we can look at President Obama as a very unique individual in terms of the presidency compared to most of the people that, well, all of the other individuals that we've had as president. It's been a pretty small narrow pool of individuals. So when you say, well, they're of European descent, well, really of a particular part of Europe. It's not like it's been Southern Europe or Eastern Europe to become president. It's really people of the British Isles and some parts of the Germanic area, by and large, really, of Europe. That's been the area. All males, and when it comes to religion, pretty mainstream, I guess you can say, for the most part, with very little difference there as well. Well, let's think about personalities for president, and this may give us, some interesting insights of looking at the president. Do you consider an individual's personality, if you're a voter, for example, voting for president, should you think about whether or not they have a personality that would fit with the presidency? Whether you think that they are kind of an even-keeled individual, that they have, that they're likable, that they are willing to accept criticism. Some of the things that you probably would consider if you were the manager at Long John Silver's and you wanted someone to, cook hush puppies, you would probably consider what kind of personality they had. Well, should we make that kind of determination when we're looking at someone to be in charge of the executive branch? And so political scientist James David Barber suggested we should think about an individual's presidency. So he had 4 different personality types that he would break down the presidents in. And some of those personality types were far better than others when it comes to selecting an individual to be president, looking at individuals who are president, and you should then in fact consider an individual's personality type. As far as Barber was concerned, and this is just his theory, of course, but Barber's viewpoint, the best type of personality was active positive. So active, meaning that they were very active in the job. They worked at it. They were there quite some time. But during that time, they had a positive viewpoint. So they enjoyed the job. I think we know that too. We can look at people who work really hard at a particular job, but that doesn't necessarily make them really good at it, or that they actually are enjoying the job. And so someone may put in some long hours and not get a whole lot done and not be very happy about it. So it should be a combination. Active in the energy level, but also positive in the outlook. And people who are in this category, such as Franklin Roosevelt, would be willing to accept criticism. And the important part about that is that, and of course, it's not like everyone's just really happy about criticism, but the ability to say, okay, that didn't work. What do we need to change, and why do we need to change it, and how can we change it? And so an active positive president is most likely to do that. The ability to accept criticism also means the ability to change, and that becomes very important as far as Barber's concerned for a president. Roosevelt was able to do that. Passive positive, similar to the active positive, but just not at the same energy level. So a president like Ronald Reagan, and all the presidents that I have in these different categories were successful presidents. Think about that top 10 list. So you see Reagan in that top 10 list. But according to Barber, he was not active in his job, that he was willing to allow others to take over considerable leadership positions, and was not really in charge of his own executive branch. Not that everyone really agrees with that, that looks over the Reagan presidency, although there is some real questions about Reagan's health at the end of his presidency. His own family has now, it's a bit of a frightening thought, but has now made the statements that they believe he was suffering from Alzheimer's in the last year or so of his presidency. So perhaps in some ways, when you look at energy level, a lot of it has to do with just the physical status of a president. But So passive positive, just a way to kind of summarize it, too complacent when it comes to leadership. Then you have passive negative, and this is an interesting category according to Barber, that they're not real active in the job and they're not real happy about the job. And they can still be effective presidents, even though that's not a real great personality. Most likely they would not be effective presidents. But Eisenhower, as we see here in this picture, was actually a very successful president. There's been a lot of reviews of his presidency to consider that perhaps it should be ranked up even higher than where it is. But even though this picture shows him as a really happy guy there, he didn't seem to be really happy about being president. Didn't like to do all the activities that presidents have to do. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's not effective at being president. But still, there was not a high energy level and not a real positive outlook about being president. So while it worked for him, maybe it wouldn't work for other individuals that had that personality type. And we do have to come back again to the question of health. Eisenhower had 2 heart attacks while he was president, and that certainly may have had an impact on his ability to just physically be active as a president. And last, we have the active negative area, which is the one that you should really avoid according to Barber. This is the most, well, could be frightening when we're looking at the world with nuclear weapons. But in Woodrow Wilson's time, you still had the ability to make some massive war efforts. He was the president during World War I. But this is a personalities type for a president that is least likely to accept criticism. And so that's the area there for the active negative. And so if they're least likely to accept criticism, they're least likely to make changes. Once again, here we are, 3 of these 4 presidents that I've mentioned, you could clearly look at health issues while they were president, although Franklin Roosevelt certainly had his own health issues and seemed to be pretty positive about it in terms of his presidency. He was able to soldier on through there. But Woodrow Wilson had a stroke while he was president, could not walk or talk for several months while he was president. So once again, you have to take that in consideration, his ability to have a very high energy level. But so when you look this over, the presidents that I've listed here, you had Franklin Roosevelt, active positive, the best personality style to have. Ronald Reagan, passive positive, too complacent to be president, although clearly very positive about being president. Active negative, Dwight Eisenhower, just really not liking the presidency. And then most likely to not accept criticism, the active negative presidents, and Woodrow Wilson. And the personality style to avoid the most in this case. But again, you do have questions about health, and then all 4 of those presidents were still in their own way successful. Which leads us to question what does make a good president, an effective president. And the Emperor Napoleon, who was also a very good general, one of the best in history, and very effective at military decision making, although he perhaps read his own headlines too much. But he was asked one time, what is a general's greatest attribute? What does a general need to have more than anything else to be successful? And I've thought about that quote because I think it can perhaps tie into the presidency as well. And Bonaparte said the general's greatest attribute was luck. That was it, luck. So for everything we say about skill and ability, personality, listening to others, all these things, education, is it right place, right time? Wrong place, wrong time? Is that where it comes down to? It does make you wonder. You've got to think there's a little more skill involved in that. But just to kind of throw that into the mix, perhaps one of the ways of ranking one president over another might have something to do with just the luck of the draw, and that events happen that are in some cases just beyond the control of a president. You will see here on pages 529 to 533 the advisors to the president. Here we won't go into a lot of detail. You just really need to follow those pages, and it's very important to do so because you do see that there are hundreds, really thousands of individuals that a president has some influence over, and it's of course difficult to have that direct influence for many of those individuals. But when a person is elected president, there are many other people that are brought into positions of authority, and it's very important to take that into consideration. So read those pages 529 to 533. Now currently, these are the individuals that we have here that are the cabinet officials in what's referred to as the inner cabinet. These are the closest cabinet officials in terms of advisors to a president. Every president has a different management style. So it may not mean that these individuals are going to be in contact with President Trump that often, depends on his personality style. But it should mean that they are more likely to be in contact with him than other members of the cabinet. And it generally works out that way for most other presidents. And these are the original cabinet positions, and these were the ones then under George Washington. There has been one slight change that occurred after World War II. So up until World War II, there was not a Defense Department. It was called the War Department, and so that name changed after World War II. But those are the 4 cabinet posts, and these are the current individuals in those cabinet posts in the inner cabinet. You will see, if you read through the Constitution, and also in this chapter, there's some references to the 25th Amendment. The ability to remove a president becomes a very difficult situation. It's never happened. This has been in place since the 1960s. So for a good period of our history, we could not use this. Now, some of the argument for this was the Kennedy assassination. And so the question being that even after a horrible wound that Kennedy received in Dallas, what if he somehow was able to survive, but was not in a situation in which he could govern? So in some ways, a vegetative state. Does that mean that you can now replace the president? But of course, beyond that is to look at some really questionable areas, a president's mental capacity if we're dealing with some areas of schizophrenia or a stroke or Alzheimer's. You know, how do you make those determinations? And with that in place, you have Congress and the cabinet that would be involved in removing an individual from the presidency. But to go that direction would mean you're talking about someone who was sworn into that job, and the ability then to just remove that individual can be just a massive undertaking, and would certainly not be pleasing to everyone in the country to see that happen. But there may be a situation in which it's necessary. It is certainly necessary to have someone who is able to make decisions in a very short period of time. As I've mentioned before, not pleasant to think about, but we live in a world, and we have since the 1950s, in which we're 30 minutes away from nuclear holocaust. That's it, 30 minutes. And so the need then for a president to make an incredible decision. And just kind of let that sink in for a little bit. You know, would you have the ability, if you were president, to give the green light to launch a missile that could kill, upon contact, millions of people? Not a few, millions of people. And that is what we're probably the highest, well, clearly the highest stake that we see. And then there is that question of what to do if a president is unable to be able to carry out the activities of the job. And that, just kind of go full circle on this, is to see that ongoing question about where is the power of the presidency? How much power should there be? And has technology got us to the point where we have to give more power to the presidency, despite what Congress or the bureaucracy or the Supreme Court even may say? But we're not the first society that's been dealing with this. And so the Romans certainly had that debate. Is there maybe are benefits to have the emperor system in terms of being able to govern a much larger territory, have a much more powerful army, to have an empire, and to have colonies. And so you have other states that are going to be really subservient to your form of government and your culture. But by doing that, do you give up something of your original self? You give up some core of who you are. And that was certainly a debate that the Romans had, that they are to be a republic, and no one individual is to have too much power. But is the complexity of society such that you just can't continue to keep that system? And whether you like it or not, you have a system that creeps more and more towards an emperor system. And we have that debate, as we clearly can see in our society today. Well, so that's what we are with. That's where we wrap up here with the presidency. And we'll be turning our attention to the last two chapters. And that will be chapter 14, bureaucracy. And after that, our last chapter, chapter 15, the Supreme Court.